This is the Farming for a Better Climate podcast. Hello and welcome to this Farming for a Better Climate podcast. My name is Séamus Murphy, and today I am unfortunately not joined by Robert Ramsey. Robert is busy with other stuff today, so it's just myself. But I am joined by another colleague of mine, Jack Zuill. How are you doing, Jack?
Yeah, not too bad. How's it going?
Good, good. So we've been looking at over the last few months. We've been kind of looking at each of the different, each sector, we'll say, of agriculture. So we've been looking at beef, sheep, arable, all the kind of, and seeing how they've been affected by the recent kind of global shocks that have kind of that have hit the world over the last 12 months. But prior to that, we did a lot of looking at carbon markets and trying to explain how carbon markets and all that kind of thing were working. And I thought that it would be good to get you to come in and just give us a bit of an introduction or a background into how we can monitor and report and verify. So the whole kind of what's called as MRV, um, and look at how we are progressing in that area in terms of carbon markets. So essentially, if you restore a peatland, how do we know that that peatland is going to achieve what it set out to achieve? Similarly with woodlands, how will that kind of the the positive benefits of that in terms of the carbon benefits and the carbon markets, how can we assure that it is doing what it says in the tin, essentially? So I thought it'd be good to bring you in on that because I know you've got a lot of experience there, but we're kind of harkening back to that series on carbon markets that we did at the beginning of the year. So yeah, do you want to give a bit of a background to your own kind of expertise in this area?
Yeah, no. As I said, my name's Jack. I'm in the environment team for SSC Consulting, and a lot of my work at the moment is linked to looking at peatland restoration. So we've currently become a verifier and validation body for peatland carbon code. So being involved in that, and also we've been working on other projects looking at using newer technologies such as drone and LiDAR and satellites for monitoring carbon storage, carbon stock, and kind of looking at ways you can monitor these environments as they change, which is really important if you're wanting to see and make sure that the carbon and the changes you're making are doing what they say they will, and
Yeah.
having confidence in those changes you're making.
And so let's go through this kind of from the start. Hypothetically, if you're a farmer and you decide you're lucky enough that you've got a portion of the farm that is in peatland or is peatland, it's degraded and you want to restore it. Before you do anything, like what is the mechanism of getting that peatland from degraded to restored peatland?
Well, so with peatlands, it's it's less about sequestering carbon and more about stopping emissions, because when your peatland starts degrading, so when it's losing, so when it dries up, it starts eroding, you change your vegetation, you're unlocking all this waterlogged anoxic organic matter, which then starts emitting more methane. So it's about stopping that emission, or at least reducing it to its natural level. So to kind of go into that process, you have your degraded peatlands. You'd be looking to kind of, if you've got hags and gullies, so quite erosional kind of features, you'd be looking to kind of reprofile those, put in some drain blocking, just trying to stop erosion where it is, bring up the water table, and try and promote more bog friendly plants. So you'd want to be kind of getting your more natural biota back into the area.
And to do that, then, like, what is the actual process? Do you contact Peatland Action, or is it, can you do it through the Peatland Code directly? Or and I suppose what might be interesting or good to bottom out for listeners would be what is actually the difference between Peatland Action and the Peatland Code, those two kind of organizations.
you could do it either way. So as you said, Peatland Action is there. So Peatland Action is run by Nature Scott, and it's government funded money to kind of support you restoring peatlands. And then you've got the Peatland Carbon Code, which is a voluntary kind of carbon credit mark scheme, similar to the Woodland Carbon Code, which is basically you can restore, and as long as you keep to their guidelines, and they have really good guidelines run by guidelines online, um, you can you can basically, if you're restoring, you'll get set amount of carbon saved from that, which then translates to credits that they kind of hold and put onto this marketplace, which you can then sell for for money or keep hold of. And the idea is that by doing that and creating value, those credits should be able to help fund the restoration. So it's kind of either going private or public in money. At the moment, most people go through a blended, but I think the shift is trying to make the private side more attractive, lucrative, and
Mm.
attractive.
And that blended approach, then that's kind of the combination of your peatland action public money with the private finance that you can get from the peatland code.
You can go through Peatland Action to get your whole project funded. For the most part, so you go through their steps, so they control the process. They tender, and you go through the feasibility study, which looks at whether or not your site is suitable for restoration. Then they move on to the restoration phase, where they'll put out to tender for contracts to get that restored. And most of that can be funded through Peatland Action if it meets their criteria. You can also then go through Peatland Carbon Code joint with that, and basically claim credits on that restoration. However, in that case, not all of your project can be publicly funded, so some of that has to be privately funded to be applicable for the Peatland Carbon Code if you're going down the Peatland Action route.
Yeah, so essentially you can't use public money to fully fund a project that will deliver carbon credits to you, and then you can make money off of that through the use of public funds. So you have to use some of that to support the actual project.
Yeah, and the trend it's sort of going is their goal is to try and, as Peatland Code becomes more attractive and lucrative, is slowly try and phase out the public money a bit more from their side.
Mm.
So I think in the long term, the amount that can be publicly funded and still apply for Peatland Carbon Code will reduce. But at the moment, you can still get most of it funded through Peatland Action.
And then like so let's just like jump forward probably a few years even realistically.
Mhm.
You've done your feasibility study, you've done everything like that, and you get your you've begun your restoration, or maybe you've a couple of years in, the restoration has been done.
Mhm.
When how can we be sure that the restoration has been successful? And I suppose this does kind of apply. Let's stick with peatlands for the moment, but I suppose it does kind of apply to woodlands as well. How do we ensure that the woodlands have been planted appropriately, that kind of thing? So yeah, let's stick to with peatlands first. But how is that done?
With any carbon scheme where you're planting something to restore or restoring something, you're gonna, especially if you're going to claim credits for it, you're going to have some sort of long-term monitoring to make sure it's doing what it's doing. In terms of peatlands, if you're under peatland action, they will monitor it over time. In terms of under the peatland carbon code, so because you're seeking to get credits for restoring that, they do monitoring. So you do first year validation. So they have a validator verified body go out and basically look through your documentation and make sure that they're confident that what you're doing is going to do, be do what it says it's going to do. Once that's okay, after year 5, they then go out and they go and check the site and see how it's progressing, make sure there's no blaring issues, and they go and monitor that. Then they do it 10 years, and then they do it every 10 year after that, going back to more site. And each time they go back and they do that, they unlock some of those credits.
Okay. So you don't get say if a project is going to deliver, I don't know, 1,000 credits, we'll say,
Yeah.
you will get those credits intermittently as the project kind of matures. rather than
Yep.
just in a big once-off payment.
Yeah. No. So those kind of get unlocked as you go, and I'm sure you'd probably be able to explain this other side around whether or not you've got your credits which are based off of kind of expected outcome, and then you've got them when they're fully
Mm.
validated and then unlocked, and how that changes. But I don't know if you want to go into that right now.
Well, I suppose it's interesting because I think probably a lot of these projects will be kind of delivered not by farmers, we will say, maybe
Hmm.
project developers, and the farmer will get a payment,
Yeah.
um, a proportion or something. So it's just, I suppose, the thing that would be interesting there is that kind of distinction between, there's not a lot of money initially.
Mm.
There is this kind of delayed opening up of the credit. So it's not like a once off, you get paid this and then, but I suppose I assume that if something was to happen in the interim, so if you went back after 10 years and the peatland was no longer restored, we'll say, or something had happened and it was like continuing to degrade, those credits would stop. That tap would be turned off.
So the way it works at the moment, that you'd go to site, you'd go and monitor it, and then if it's not doing what it should be doing, you'd be going back to the person who's managing that site, and you'd be giving them recommendations to make those changes. But over the long term, if it's not restoring, then you're not you're not getting those credits.
Yeah.
But currently, we're only this year is the first year where we're getting those first projects being validated.
Okay.
So you got the initial projects, because the peatland code's only really come into fruition in the last, just on, I think, around the last 10 years. You're getting your first projects which are getting to that stage that where they're going to be verified. So we don't know what the long term. We have confidence in certain levels of confidence in the restoration methods we're taking, but it's going to be interesting to see what these first sites that have gone through the code are looking like in terms of restoration, and then how, whether or not, how they get approached with the credits in terms of the performance of the site, and then also what these credits will sell for in the market.
Yeah. And I suppose, but that is kind of it is a bit of a safety net, like for a farmer or a land manager who could be a bit concerned about signing up to something that then if it doesn't work. But I suppose the thing to take away there is that if it doesn't work, then there will be no additional payment of in 5 or 10 years, or you will have to do additional work to get that. So it's you're not getting a lump sum of money and then you will essentially have to give it back at some stage. That's probably not the way it's going to work. You will only get what can be kind of verified at that moment in time.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
that's interesting. And then how do you verify it? What is the process? And again, let's maybe stick with peatlands initially, but we will come on to trees. How are they kind of, you've mentioned monitoring a few times. How does that monitoring actually happen?
It's a whole range of methods. I think everyone does it differently, but you can go on site and you go and you resurvey areas is the predominant thing. You have to go out on site. You have to look at what's there, um, and basically, you remeasure the pet. You look at wetness. You look at these different positive changes that should be happening to restore it, and you basically compare it to the initial site and monitor it. The problem with that is peatlands cover massive areas. You're talking, there are smaller sites, but as we've restored most of the easy to get to sites now, so
Yeah.
we're starting to get to these quite remote destinations, really big, hundreds of hectare sites, with lots of quite tough terrain to go through.
Mm.
And if you had to get people out to go and look at every single part of that site, it just costs too much and take too much time. So they do representative walkthroughs and sites. A way that people, and this is kind of moving into how technology is now being utilized and leveraged to support this, is we're starting to try and incorporate various types of remote sensing technologies. So use of satellites, plane sensors, drones, to try and basically get information on those sites far quicker and from a distance, so that we can kind of assess a much larger area with far more confidence and use technology to do that. Um,
Yeah.
so, an example of that is there's a lot of companies at the moment, and the government as well, looking at bog breathing. So either using satellite imagery, so radar, some other types, to try and see if they can monitor wetness and the change of the bog over the seasons. And the idea is that you can kind of map out where it's healthy and where it's unhealthy. Obviously, you need to include some sort of ground truthing with that, and over time, as we develop these technologies, we'll be far more confident with just using the satellite or the remote version of it. But at the moment, you use that technology to collect site-wide data or a much larger area-wide information. You process that, and it can either give you tailored information on the whole site, or it can tell you areas where you need to go onto site. So kind of precision field work, where you reduce the time you need to do walking the site, and you're only going to the areas that you know need to be explored further. Um, so kind of reducing time in your surveying, and should hopefully give you a far better understanding of the site than if you were just doing a random transect walk over it.
Yeah. It seems as well like a big benefit to that would be that you will visually be able to see any change. Like for instance, if you go onto site and you take you do your kind of ground survey, we'll say, if in 5 or 10 years time you're actually not no longer doing that kind of work, or whoever it is has kind of moved on, the person who comes out is kind of, I assume they will have some sort of information and pictures, but you're kind of you're just working off of the best available data from the previous surveyor, whereas I suppose with this approach you know exactly what it looked like on that day.
A huge benefit of these sort of technologies is as you said, you're collecting a snapshot in time of the site. That's data that's there that you can then use in the future. So if you go back to resurvey it, the other thing is it's allowing us to revisit sites and kind of keep a digital trail of the information, so that
Yeah.
you know if it, the idea is that hopefully over time it will improve the confidence in those credits for people who are buying them, because or for people who are holding them or restoring. There's studies at the moment that are looking at using satellite to pick up drains in peatlands, because a lot of these peatlands that were restored in the past didn't have that data trail of information of the restoration. So what they're doing is they're going back over these sites, and they're trying to use it to kind of automatically pick out where the drains are, to see they actually did what they said they were going to do.
Yeah.
Because if you need to have that confidence in the information you're giving out, otherwise people are not going to invest in it.
Yeah, yeah, and because that's it, and I suppose that will affect the price as well that you're that you can get for those credits. So if a farmer or a land manager, I suppose, wanted to do it themselves, because they saw that there was a huge kind of, maybe not a huge, but there was kind of money to be made if they did went down that route. I suppose having that really robust data behind the work that you've done,
Hmm.
so you can really prove that it was done and done to a good standard and that's working, you would assume that that would have a positive impact on the price of the credit, because it would be yeah, an extremely high quality credit.
Yeah, and there's lots of people looking at this at the moment using other technology. So I was up on a site last week that was using audio moths. So basically little and
Mm,
camera traps. So a camera trap, you put it on a tree, and it basically has a motion sensor, and it'll take a picture or video when something moves in front, so you can start looking at wildlife. And then audio moths are the equivalent, but for sound. And when they hear a sound, they'll record it. So there's using other types of sensors to basically, or there's also Internet of Things. So feeding these all together. So you've got on our mountain research and hill research center, they've got sensors looking at water level. They've got sensors looking at
mm,
the weather, and collecting all this information gives you a long-term picture of those sites. And oftentimes you can just leave it there to collect that information.
yeah.
Very little impact on you. Once you've got it, you can then process that, and it gives you better understanding of the changes you're making to your land and the impacts they're having on, well, in our case, that we're talking about peatlands, but also if you're looking at restoring biodiversity or forestry,
Yeah.
all those areas.
I'm assuming by the sounds of it that it all sounds great, but it also sounds like it could be expensive. Is that true?
Yeah, it's always getting cheaper. We're
Mm,
obviously, as a consultancy, using quite expensive kit. There's a lot cheaper kit, and it's always getting, the newer versions of drones are getting smaller, cheaper, and can fly a lot longer.
mhm,
Satellite data, there's a lot of open source free versions that don't necessarily give you the same quality you get with the paid ones, but can still give you a fairly good idea of your site. And then also all these other pieces of kits at AudioMods. There's ones that cost thousands of pounds, but you could also buy them for, a few hundred.
yeah.
But you're right, it's accessibility, and it's improving all the time. But
Yeah.
when you factor it in with actually going out and surveying a site, it can oftentimes be a lot cheaper to have that out there than
Mm.
have someone having to continuously go out and do these surveys. It's striking that balance between the two.
Yeah, and it probably like, there's no one suggesting that an individual farmer would go and do this stuff themselves anyway. So I suppose it could be something that when it comes to that verification, that time to verify that, a verification or some sort of body or support could be there to carry out this kind of higher level of detail survey or something.
Mm.
So yeah, it remains to be seen, but it all sounds like it's quite positive in terms of like the actual the data that could be collected just to improve that confidence and robustness in the current kind of carbon markets that are out there, or the current
Mhm.
um, carbon markets, most popular carbon markets, I suppose, which would be the peatland code and the woodland carbon code. So in terms of I know that your experience is mainly around um, peatlands, but I know you've been doing some kind of work recently that's quite interesting around woodlands, and particularly kind of, I suppose that those kind of s- farm woodlands that aren't your standard commercial plantations of Sitka spruce. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So we've been working on a another Scottish government funded project. So it's a CATA, so it's a Knowledge Transfer and Innovation Fund
Mm,
project looking at kind of a farm carbon storage network. So the idea behind it is we've well, in this case we've looked at 5 farms, trying to represent the variation of agricultural systems across Scotland. So upland farming, arable, lowland, island, croft. So kind of that range of areas, and the whole project's kind of looking at trying to just do a carbon stock baseline to try and understand what you've got on your farm already, and kind of give a understanding of that, and then hopefully in the future give a value to that. For now, it's just trying to quantify that. So we looked at A, soil carbon stock, and then B, the carbon that's stored in above ground biomass. So your trees and your hedges. We're not looking at sequestration, so not what's being absorbed at the time. It's purely looking at what's already trapped there in these features. But so what we were trying to do is so your traditional methods would be, so for example, you were talking about the forestry and these non-traditional woodlands, so not your commercial plantation, let's say, is we're trying to find a way to better quantify the carbon stored in ancient woodlands, ancient plantation, riparian trees that were planted, long time ago, that do not follow the same shape form that you'd get from a commercial plantation. And what I mean by that is, so when you're planting commercially, it's all done. So you have a set distance depending on the type of tree you're planting. You usually have a set distance between the mound that you're planting those trees. You know when you've planted them, you know the age, you know when they're being thinned, and so they've got quite clear, with woodland carbon code, they've got quite clear guidelines for estimating your carbon storage, because you can feed in all these things to kind of estimate that. When you've got trees that have natural regen, which are not planted in that set frame, which have varieties of species, you don't know how old they are, they all grow very differently. So it's much harder to put them in that same mold for calculating those values. So what we were trying to do is try and use remote sense data. So in this case, our drone with lidar to kind of estimate the carbon in those features, put it into a model, and then estimate the carbon stored in them.
That's really interesting. What we've, I suppose, talked about previously in terms of the peatlands, do you think that that kind of technology or that approach could also be used in terms of verifying woodland? Maybe not even just for the woodland carbon code, but just in general in verifying the additional carbon that could be stored in hedges and trees across farms and shelter belts, and I suppose these areas that are, a lot of the woodland carbon code stuff is focused predominantly on quite large areas of commercial woodland. Right now it's baseline, but is change kind of on the agenda?
Well, yeah, this is all about creating a baseline. And if you have a good baseline, then you can start looking at where your opportunities lie. So you can start seeing where maybe you could plant more trees, you could restore hedgerow if there's gaps in your hedgerow. You can as long the information you've got is helping you make better decision making on promoting more carbon storage or biodiversity or you know whatever whatever you're trying to improve. With woodlands, especially commercial, because you have these great mechanisms, there are already people looking at using these systems for that because the equations are far simpler. You know how they're growing, so actually the same data, the lidar data we're collecting for these more complex environments, can be used for that, and actually it'd be far easier and straightforward to measure those. And you're already seeing it. So there's a lot of drones or planes and also satellite data, which is taking whether it's photos or taking elevation or laser or lidar of the change of that forest over time, and which they can quite because everything's growing at the same time as all being planted. It's all uniform. They
Yeah.
can really hone in those predictions.
So I suppose one thing that's becoming more and more important, and there's a when I've been at farmer meetings, I've heard this before. There's a bit of a reluctance, I suppose, in terms of on the farmer side of things to share data, I suppose, with maybe kind of bigger organizations and stuff like that. And have you got any thoughts on that? I suppose when we're looking at this kind of data that could be quite a lot of data and maybe quite important to the farmer or to the land manager. Is there kind of what are your thoughts on that?
I'm no expert in kind of copyright and ownership law, so I can't really
Mm,
go into the details on data ownership and sharing of that. I know a lot of people are quite worried about how their information is being used, who has access to it, and also the value of it. So there's all this information, as you said, being collected that's incredibly valuable, and it's how do we share it? Can we get value from that? Who do we share it to, and how do we make sure that it's not being abused?
mhm.
So there's a lot of groups looking at trying, for example, anonymizing information. So you see that with the way your phone data is collected, where when you've got your location data, it's all anonymized under a random code. So they don't know who or what's doing what, but it's giving you information for the area. When it's combined into this massive mass, you end up with just the trends. So if we're just pulling out trends of information for a region, if we can anonymize that regional data, so we just say it's from this region, but it's only not saying who it's from exactly, that's a way to kind of keep your anonymity.
Yeah,
Obviously, it gets far more complex than that. That's only one situation. At the end of the day, if you want those really fine statistics, if you're using a self-steering tractor, for example, with Trimble have one of these auto steers, so
yeah,
you put in your topography, you put in your where your tramline area, and it does it for you. That all that information's been shared with Trimble already. It's going into their system. So yeah, it's in this day and age, it's really hard to keep track of where that all is, and it's going to be a massive challenge with all this information that's being collected on people's lands about who has
Mm,
access to it, who can use it, how do we keep it secure, but also how do we verify that that information that's being collected in a way that is following an approved methodology, so you're not so that the data you're collecting can be trusted, so you know that that information has been collected properly. How do you also verify that it's been collected where you say it is, and then also how do
mm,
we protect it from from manipulation in terms of just all this digital information that could be hacked, stolen, altered, all sorts of things. So yeah, we live in an age of information, and it's probably one of the biggest challenges of our time. To be honest,
yeah.
it's no different in farming and agriculture and in these sectors that we're collecting so much information. It's what do we do with it? How do we keep it safe? And how do we make the most of it and keep, but also not take advantage of it?
Yeah, and that also applies, I suppose. Like we're kind of talking about, using, I suppose, landscape data and things like that, but it also does apply in terms of like farm business information and kind of carbon audit data, things like that. That I suppose it's yeah, there's a lot of kind of concerns, I suppose, over to who has access and what it can be used for, and yeah, all of that kind of stuff. But listen, I think that was a great discussion, Jack, and thanks very much for coming on.
No, thanks for having me, Seamus.
For more information on some of the topics that we covered today, please visit the Farming for a Better Climate website, and you can listen to more episodes of the Farming for a Better Climate podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Bye.